the Texas coastline.
There is an increasing attack on freedom of religion, speech, and
comment. Welcome to the Issachar Hour, examining law, policy, and culture through the lens of the Judeo-Christian worldview to help you understand the times and know what you ought to do.
Those violent protests erupting overnight at UC Berkeley. The campus locked down as more than 1,000 people rallied against the appearance of a controversial editor from Breitbart, Milo Yiannopoulos. The clash has escalated. The speech was canceled, and just moments ago, President Trump did weigh in again. ABC's Kana Warworth is on the scene in Berkeley with all the latest. Good morning, Kana.
And George, good morning. It was a terrifying night. Campus police issuing a shelter-in-place order after college Republicans invited Milo Yiannopoulos to speak. Now, behind me, this is a police generator that was knocked over and set on fire when these protests turned into a riot. Overnight mayhem on campus. The University of California, Berkeley erupting in flames as over 1,000 came out to protest an appearance by the self-described right-wing internet troll Milo Yiannopoulos.
We will not tolerate racism or sexism or hate crimes and violence. He's a fascist, and Berkeley did not welcome him.
At least 6 people were injured, including this Trump supporter who was pepper sprayed. The university canceling the speech.
Hey, Milo, we shot you down.
Riot police even retreating to the building for safety. You can hear them urging the crowds to leave.
I think we have a right to say that we don't want him here. And
the standoff intensifying as protesters lit fireworks, police firing back.
It's going too far right now. This is uncalled for. This is not going to get no message across.
Yiannopoulos, an editor for Breitbart News and an avid supporter of President Trump, responding on Facebook, posting this video.
Because they're so threatened by the idea that a conservative speaker might be persuasive and interesting and funny and might persuade, might take some people with him. They just have to shut it down at all costs.
And President Trump taking to Twitter this morning, asking the question, no federal funds if UC Berkeley does not allow free speech. Robin.
All right, Kana, thank you very much.
Well, good day, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Welcome to the Issachar Hour on MTM TV. MTM is the TBN of the Caribbean. My name is Wayne West. This is my wife, Doreen. And we are discussing over the next few episodes the closing of the university mine. Is that correct? That's what we're supposed to be doing?
Well, yes, that is a topic that we are looking at today on the Issachar Hour. The closing of the university mine. What we mean by that? Well, I think the video that we opened with is a good illustration of the end product of that closing of the mine, because certainly
a very dynamic closure, I must say.
Those
dramatic fire.
Those students who set that fire, burned the place down almost, in order to prevent the speaker from saying what he thought. It was in fact a dangerous and a dramatic and an extreme form of suppression of free speech.
The closing of the university mine. Isn't that an
suppression
oxymoron?
Of free speech.
Isn't that an oxymoron?
Well, I don't know.
Oxymoron, by the way, is something where you put together two opposing concepts. So it's like saying a girl boy. That's an oxymoron.
Well, some people say an honest lawyer. Or
something
like that.
I didn't want to get into that.
Well, I mean, girl boy is not usually an oxymoron. That's just silly to say girl boy. Right. An oxymoron is using two terms which usually are mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
So like, okay, let us say honest doctor, honest lawyer, so on, right?
So a closed university mine is an oxymoron. Should
in a way
should
it should
be an
oxymoron because at the university, the one thing you ought to have at the university is an open mind. In that, what you mean an open mind is it ought to be a place where free ideas contend.
Free exchange of ideas.
Contend freely.
Yeah.
And persons are able to analyze, to look at facts, to listen, to talk, to dialogue, and to conclude by reason.
Debate,
reason. Test what you believe in the face of what other persons contend against what you believe. So test what you believe against the opposite contention.
By argument.
By argument and by reason.
Yeah, using logic.
Yes, and in a university, if nowhere else, the remedy for speech that is false ought to be speech that is true.
That is Anthony Kennedy, yeah?
Right. So in a university, if nowhere else, that ought to be the way it operates.
But at the University of California at Berkeley, that wasn't so. In fact, the guy who was supposed to be speaking there is a fellow called Milo Yiannopoulos. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He is of Greek ancestry, but I think he's British, and he is himself a homosexual. And he is, however, a conservative homosexual.
Yes, conservative views.
He wrote for a magazine called Breitbart, which is a right-wing conservative magazine. And the University at California, Berkeley is a liberal left-wing institution. And the students there were having none of it that he should come and give a talk there.
No, he was invited there.
By the conservative students.
Absolutely. So he didn't just appear on the campus and say, here am I am going to impose my views on you students who don't want to hear me.
No.
He was invited there by one section of the student body, we must say that.
Yeah.
And he came in response to their invitation.
Yeah.
So those students who did not want to hear him had a simple remedy, just not turn up.
Well, no, that wasn't good enough. They took it literally to the streets. They say he couldn't talk. And in fact, he wasn't able to.
He wasn't allowed to because they burned the place down rather than
the riot police that came there had to take shelter.
Yes.
Such was the venom and the aggression.
And they had to warn him not to come.
No, you're paying for these students to go on campus to learn something, but what they learn is street language. Because you don't need to go to university to argue. To argue, I use the word argue in quotation
By
marks.
setting a fire.
By setting fire, breaking up the place. No, you don't need to do that. You can do that from just sitting on the street.
Yeah.
So why have the universities come to this place?
What is that about?
What has brought them?
And we should say that it's not an isolated incident.
No.
Okay, it's probably one of the more extreme forms of expression of disagreement.
Yeah.
But it's not an isolated incident. It has happened at other campuses where speakers are violently prevented from saying their point of view. And Coulter was prevented from giving her point of view.
There was an Australian feminist, Germaine Greer, who, because she said that transgender women, who are really biological men, are not women, she was to speak on a campus in England. I can't remember which one, but they made sure she couldn't do it. So we're having this way of debating, of using power.
Or not debating.
Well, yeah, I use the word debating tongue in cheek. So there's this way of university students expressing their disagreement and taking the debate in the form of what you would talk, street talk, rather than what you would expect coming out of the academy.
Well, it's violent suppression of free speech. That's what it is.
And it is.
And the question is, why is it happening in universities?
And the reason, of course, it's happening is because this is a manifestation of what is known as cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism has its roots in Marxist ideology. And we want to introduce our listeners to one of the persons who, to be fair to him, he doesn't accept the anti-intellectual way that leftist students behave nowadays. But he was one of the pillars, the philosophical pillars on which cultural Marxism was built.
Okay, but he may not accept the way they are expressing that now, the extreme way. But shouldn't he have anticipated that it would come to this?
No. Actually, in the video we're going to show, because we're going to show an interview with a gentleman by the name of Herbert Marcuse. I hope I pronounced his name properly. I have challenges with name. And he was a French thinker, but he was one of the original people from what's called the Frankfurt School. And he is being interviewed by a philosopher who will tell us, and we will take it up from there, how the Frankfurt School, its brand of Marxism, etc., morphed into what we are seeing on campuses like the University of California at Berkeley.
Right, but the question I'm asking, and I would invite the readers to think about, should it have been anticipated? Should they have been able to predict that if we take society along this way of labeling people, putting them into compartments, saying this one is an oppressor and this one is oppressed, and doing that, shouldn't you expect this kind of confrontation to occur?
You know, actually, when you think about it, Marxism is about revolution.
Exactly.
And it's about confrontation.
Exactly.
It was about confrontation.
So it should have been anticipated.
So economic Marxism is about confrontation between the owners of production and the people who they oppress. So naturally, cultural Marxism would also manifest itself
as confrontation between people, persons in different labels. The containers are different, but it's still confrontation.
So inevitably it would lead to confrontation.
It should have been anticipated at this point.
And it is. So we are going to take a look now at an interview with Herbert Marcuse, one of the leaders of modern leftist thought and one of the founders of the Frankfurt School.
The economic convulsions that racked Western societies between the two world wars were seen at the time by most Marxists as being the breakdown of the capitalist system which Marxist theory had always predicted. However, whereas according to the theory this was supposed to lead to communism, in not one single such Western society did communist regimes emerge. What did emerge in several of them was fascism. Some Marxists were disillusioned by this, to the point of abandoning Marxism. Others refused to question Marxist theory regardless of what actually happened. But there were many in between, people who remained or wanted to remain Marxists, but who felt that Marxism would have to be seriously re-examined if it was to continue to remain credible. One such group of people came together in Frankfurt in the late 1920s and have come to be known since as the Frankfurt School. Actually, they didn't stay in Frankfurt long, but the name has stuck. They left Germany in the early 1930s, in the period just before and after the Nazis came to power, and by the mid-30s the key figures had all settled in the United States. These, to mention three, were Adorno, a man who seemed equally at home in philosophy, sociology and music, Horkheimer, a philosopher cum sociologist, less brilliant than Adorno but perhaps more solid, and the one who has turned out in the end to be the most famous and influential of them all, the political theorist Herbert Marcuse. Their influence grew slowly, but grew nevertheless over a long period and reached a spectacular peak in the 1960s. Many things contributed to this. One was the powerful revisionist movement among Marxist and communist countries throughout Eastern Europe, culminating in the Prague Spring of 1968. This put the Frankfurt School in line for the first time with real-life developments inside the communist world. Another, obviously related, was the tremendous revival of interest in Marxism among people in the West, especially educated young people. This also culminated in 1968, the year which saw the high point of student violence all over Europe and the United States, and looked for a moment in Paris as if it might even come close to genuine revolution. The would-be revolutionaries of that day proclaimed one man more than others as their political mentor, and that was Marcuse. They painted the walls with phrases from his books in order to make it known to the world that they were going to turn his ideas into reality. And although the revolution didn't materialize, during the decades since then, the ideas of Marcuse and the Frankfurt School have come to dominate some of the social science departments in various countries in Europe, and through them to have a continued and very important influence on the young. Professor Marcuse, why should it have been to your writings that the revolutionary student movements of the 1960s and early 70s turned?
Well, I was not the mentor of the student activists of the 60s and early 70s. What I did is formulate and articulate some ideas and some goals that were in the air at that time. That is about it. The student generation that became active in these years did not need a father figure or a grandfather figure in order to lead them to protest against a society which revealed daily its inequality, injustice, cruelty, and its general destructiveness. They could experience that. They saw it before their own eyes. As features of the society, I only mention the heritage of fascism. Fascism was militarily defeated. The potential for a repetition was still there. I would like to mention racism, sexism, the general insecurity, the pollution of the environment, the degradation of education, the degradation of work, and so on and so on. In other words, what exploded in the 60s and early 70s was a blatant contrast between the tremendous available social wealth and its miserable, destructive, and wasteful use.
So we were looking at the interview between Professor Brian McGee, and he's a philosopher, and Herbert Marcuse, who is or was really a philosopher as well, but he introduced some new concepts in terms of philosophy. So
did he create the term cultural Marxism?
No, and in fact, there are persons who believe that that term really refers to
by conservatives.
By conservative, and not only that, but the whole concept of cultural Marxism is fiction and fantasy.
Okay, so what did Marcuse call his concept? Because he must have had a concept. What name did
he called it Marxism.
Marxism,
but
Marxism.
You see what happened. You see,
but he recognized it wasn't the same old Marxism that existed when Marx was around. So
no,
it was a different form.
It was a different form in that Marx, if you recall, occurred in the 1900s, when the Industrial Revolution was just about taking place, and you had the workers who were slaved, quote unquote, for the owners of production. So the owners of production lived well,
the oppressors,
and the workers were poor.
Oppressed. Yes.
Now, one of the things that happened is that after World War I, the Marxist theory suggested that all the workers of the world would unite, and they would unite against the oppressors who were the owners of production. But instead of French workers uniting with German workers and so on, the British workers fought against the German workers, and that threw Marxist theory of workers rising up against the owners of production into chaos. So some Marxist thinkers, formed this school called the Frankfurt School.
So it was formed in Germany?
In Germany, to look in the 1920s to see, well, what happened? Because instead of there
what
being
they predicted did not happen.
Marxist revolution, you had the rise of fascism. So you had
and there was still patriotism to your country, and you fought for your country against other workers in the same situation.
Absolutely, and that just didn't make sense in Marxist theory. So the Frankfurt School was formed by persons from Germany, mainly from Germany, who were going to look as to why it is that Marxism, economics, traditional Marxism, didn't do what it was supposed to do. But in Germany in the 1920s, going to the 1930s, something happened. Hitler, the fascism and the Nazi fascism started. So they had to leave Germany and they went to America.
Okay.
So the members of the Frankfurt School went to America, and significant among them was the one who really captured the minds of the students in the universities and so on in the 1960s, was Herbert Marcuse,
who we heard in the interview.
And what he was saying is that, listen, you have to adjust Marxism. He didn't want to give up on Marxism. You have to adjust it.
It has to move with the times.
To accommodate the reality of what happened in the war and the reality of what was facing people in the industrialized society who were consuming more, but there was still issues of
oppression,
racism, sexism. Now, if you hear me, those are the same words that the young one of the protesters at Milo in California and Berkeley used. She used the same words: racism, sexism. That is the link, in that you're not just being oppressed now because of economics, but you are being oppressed because of certain cultural considerations.
Well, yes. So
this is where the term cultural Marxism comes from.
So he didn't invent the term, but he certainly had the concept, the idea that, look, the Marxist idea of purely economic grounds for differences between persons
and oppression
having been eliminated and having been made irrelevant by the First World War, we now have to find a different way to express the antagonism between groups of persons, even to encourage it, I think, because you still have to identify one group as the oppressed and another group as the oppressors, and not on purely economic grounds.
Right.
So it was a way of changing Marxism to make it still relevant.
Well,
yes, to maintain the relevance of Marxist thought in a new paradigm. That's what I think.
No, but it's true. But there is some truth to the analysis in that. In sociology, there's the concept of majority and minority groups. The majority group is not necessarily the group with the numbers, but it's the group with the power. And so in bringing Marxist analysis out of economics and bringing it into the other concept of social and cultural, you now have much more problems that you can identify.
And you have many more oppressed groups to identify.
And in fact, that is where the whole concept of what's called identity politics
comes about. Which we're going to talk about as well.
Identity politics. So cultural Marxism, although like I said, people on the left seek to dismiss it as though it's a conspiracy theory or something that doesn't really exist. It does exist, and it exists in the universities. The humanities departments of many Western universities basically are involved not simply in teaching about, but they are actively engaged.
Not at all in teaching about, but mainly in indoctrinating persons along those principles. And you can argue about the name, cultural Marxism, but the fact of the thing, the actuality of the thing, you simply have to observe what goes on. So you can argue about the name all you want, but is there a set practice deliberately in the humanities faculties in universities, Western universities, to indoctrinate students, to reject contending ideas, and to have a monolithic kind of thinking. They who talk about diversity, they want a one way of thinking. So they encourage a diversity of behavior or of dress, but there must be no diversity in thinking. Nobody can deny that this exists.
And like I say, I just want to repeat, because today, for those who, if you've come in late, what we are talking to what we call the closing of the university mind. We are seeing why it is that when people go to universities, but they come back in a way that is intolerant of any kind of thinking. And
opposite to what they
And the reason is that universities, Western universities, in the humanities department, humanities and so on, they do not teach politics.
Or even how to think.
Or the critical analysis of politics. What they do, they teach cultural Marxism. And the indoctrination into cultural Marxism. So there is no, there's no sit down and say, well, let's look at how this started, how that started. Let us analyze this idea. Let us analyze what are the pros and cons of this. No. In places like at the University of California, Berkeley, what they teach is how to be a cultural Marxist. And in fact, you were to go there and do something else, you couldn't survive.
You could be seriously harmed.
You could be seriously harmed.
Yes.
So this is the closing of the university mind that we are seeing. That cultural Marxism, Western universities, in their humanities, government department, sociology department, are really not teachers of politics, but they are political entities advocating for. That's what Western universities are.
They have adopted a dogma, and they indoctrinate the students into this dogma. Students are not taught, this is how you think about these
about politics.
This is how you analyze politics. These are the ground rules for analyzing it. These are some of the political facts that we know have occurred historically. They are taught, this is how it is, and everyone else. So if you are pro-life, you are an oppressor.
That's right. That's
it.
So students are being taught in these universities to be political activists and advocates.
Yes. That's for one point of view.
One point of view.
Monolithic.
Wilmot Perkins used to say that the University of West Indies was the intellectual ghetto. And a ghetto really is a place that has only one type of people, like the Polish ghettos in World War II. They were mainly Jews. It referred to the Jews. It didn't necessarily mean that it was a place of poverty, but it was a place of isolation. And what Perkins was seeking to say is that with respect to some aspects of political activity in the 1970s, the University of the West Indies acted like an intellectual ghetto. In other
embracing
words,
one kind of thought.
It acted like a monolith.
Yeah.
And in fact, you will find that you will not find many Western universities providing critique of things like feminism or LGBT, because they are in fact the advocates
of that worldview,
in the context of identity
and their
politics.
role is to prevent the students from being even exposed to the alternate view.
That's right.
It's to prevent exposure to
or
it.
to think critically about
because
it.
I've seen in universities in the United States, for example, somebody comes here to speak about, let us say, Israel or something. That's another thing.
They shut it down.
Or they beat drums and they shout out and they cannot speak. So it is to prevent even exposure to an alternate worldview. And one of the terms we'd have to talk about is the term called identity politics. Because identity politics is one of the forces that is used to lock down thoughts.
Well, and there's also a use of tolerance. But let us let the listeners see exactly what cultural Marxism.
What is cultural Marxism?
What is cultural Marxism?
And as you think about the first video we showed, in that how it the outcomes of it.
Yes.
So what is it? How
what
did
is
it
cultural
start?
Marxism?
Let us begin with a very terse description. Cultural Marxism is a broad term which refers to the advocacy and application of critical theory, and more generally to the cultural, political, and academic influence of certain elements within the contemporary left. The roots of cultural Marxism are to be found in what is commonly known as the Frankfurt School. The term arose informally to describe the thinkers affiliated or merely associated with the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research at the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany during the interwar period. Critical of both capitalism and Soviet socialism, they sought to address the perceived shortcomings of classical Marxism in the pursuit of societal change. Their work came to be referred to as critical theory. Defining or categorizing critical theory is exceptionally difficult, for it pertains to a broad, almost disparate set of ideas, individuals, and approaches. The underlying and enduring aspect of critical theory, common to all its offshoots, nonetheless, is the creation of interdisciplinary theories that might serve as instruments of social transformation. During the 1960s, the Frankfurt School critical theory gained traction with some segments of the left-wing and leftist thought in both Europe and North America. Today, its influence is felt throughout Western academia, dominating the social sciences and humanities. Gender studies and whiteness studies being two such examples. One of the most influential critical theorists and an original member of the Frankfurt School was Herbert Marcuse. A cursory glance at any paragraph written by Marcuse will set alarm bells ringing for anyone even remotely familiar with the current culture of intolerance on college and university campuses. Consider the following passage from his 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance. The small and powerless minorities which struggle against the false consciousness and its beneficiaries must be helped. Their continued existence is more important than the preservation of abused rights and liberties, which grant constitutional powers to those who oppress these minorities. Social justice, feminism, neo-progressivism, and post-colonialism, to name but a few, are all movements inspired by or born out of critical theory, and thus all come under the umbrella of cultural Marxism. Be it gender, sexual orientation, family, race, culture, or religion, every aspect of a person's identity is to be questioned, every norm or standard in society challenged, and ideally altered in order to benefit supposedly oppressed groups. Classical Marxism saw class conflict as occurring between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between the haves and the have-nots. Cultural Marxism views such a conflict as existing between the oppressed and the oppressors, between those with privilege and those without it. The working class has been replaced by minorities. Majority groups are typically defined as privileged and oppressive, with minority groups accordingly labelled underprivileged and oppressed. Heterosexuals are oppressive. Cisgender people are oppressive. Whites are oppressive, especially white men. Christians are oppressive. Those that do not fit into these groups are thus considered oppressed. It stands to reason, therefore, that if heterosexuals are oppressors, the solution is to encourage other forms of sexuality. If whites are oppressors, the solution is racial diversity. If cisgender people are oppressors, the solution is to encourage transgenderism. If Christians are oppressors, the solution is to propagate Islam. Theodor Adorno, another original member of the Frankfurt School, wrote a book entitled The Authoritarian Personality, in which he defines parenthood, pride in one's family, Christianity, adherence to traditional gender roles and attitudes towards sex, and the love of one's own country as pathological phenomena. This tendency to pathologize opinions and life patterns, which are not in accordance with its own political ends, is characteristic of cultural Marxism. Differing views are thus described as irrational fears or phobias. For example, a person who feels uncomfortable living as a minority in an area dominated by Muslim migrants may be decried as an Islamophobe, since wishing to live amongst those culturally and ethnically similar to oneself is considered sick and phobic. When Pakistani Muslims living in Britain, by contrast, show in-group preference, converting entire sections of a town or city into a mini Pakistan, there is no sickness, no phobia, only multiculturalism.
So that was cultural Marxism.
Yes, it's cultural Marxism 101.
You are on the Issachar Hour, and the aim of the Issachar Hour is to help you understand the times so that you would know what to do. I think the video was very informative.
It was extremely informing, and we probably will have to play that video again, because it was so good. Because it certainly gave you from the ground level up an insight into this thing called cultural Marxism.
And how it explains what's happening today.
It explains what's happening today. One of these terms the gentleman used in the very introduction talking about cultural Marxism, he referred to critical theory. Now, some viewers might not have understood that. So, and the narrator himself admitted that it was difficult to define.
Yes, it
but
is.
He made a point of saying that it is a way of thinking. It's a way of thinking about social transformation.
To achieve social because we're dealing with, when you have a social movement or people are doing things, it's difficult to put people into categories. And everybody might have a different take on it and so, but there is a common ground. Critical theory really is a technique that the people in the Frankfurt School
developed,
to basically use the word criticize or to examine in a negative way all the things we assume to be were normal. So they would say, like, somebody would say it's not telling lies is a good thing. Well, critical theory will say, well, why is that a good thing? And seek to...
or there is objective truth.
Yes.
And they would say, why
to undermine. Seek to undermine all
the assumptions.
All the assumptions.
That are traditionally held. That's critical theory.
And
this isn't an effort to get social transformation. It must be said. So critical theory is a way, a rethinking, a revision of the traditionally held assumptions about roles, and so on. Critiquing those traditionally held assumptions in order to acquire, to achieve social transformation.
Absolutely.
We must not forget the purpose and the objective.
So something like that, we make assumptions on the family is good. A man, his children, taking care of his children, he and his wife, that's good. The critical theory is sought initially to challenge that.
Undo that.
Is that good? What makes it good? So in order to achieve
acquire, to get a social transformation.
That's right.
So that's critical theory, right? And that's a very important concept. That is a way of looking at what we traditionally hold to be true, undermining it, challenging it, rethinking
all assumptions
in order to change society. It's always in order to change society.
Because remember, these people are Marxists. They
want society to change.
They want to change the society into their
In fact, they want a reversal. They want an inversion of everything that we traditionally hold to be valuable and true. And so a lot of the current terms we hear now are outcomes of that kind of thinking.
Of that kind
of thinking. One of the interesting things. Well, he said so many interesting things in that video.
Yeah.
So many interesting points.
Well, things that pertain to what we are seeing.
What we are seeing now.
You know, again, the cultural Marxists, they use Marxism, which dealt with the oppression of the workers as opposed to the owners of production, and they generalized it to oppression within the society generally. So you have, okay, so let's talk about religion. In Western democracies, the dominant religion is Christianity.
So Christianity is oppressive.
So Christianity is oppressive.
By definition.
That is why, you know, you would notice that persons
so
who
how
are
do you
cultural,
undo that? You encourage Islam.
That's right. So persons who are cultural Marxists will never say anything bad against Islam.
In fact, they lock you up if you say anything.
That's
about
right.
In Canada, it's a crime now. Eh?
If you say anything about it, in fact, if you even suggest that there is a division of Islam that is jihadist and that causes terror, you are an Islamophobe.
Right.
And in fact, they aggressively seek to prevent any critique of Islam because Islam is oppressed.
They are the minority.
They are the
oppressed.
minority.
They are the small and powerless minority.
Christianity and Christians are the oppressors. So you can say anything bad. In fact, you ought to say bad things about Christians because Christianity is oppressive.
So you must undo them.
Yeah.
And one of the ways of undoing them is to build up Islam. In your community.
And that's what's happening in the United States.
United States, France, Belgium, Canada,
That's
all
right.
these countries.
All these countries, because
they are undoing Christianity deliberately and building up Islam deliberately and punishing Christians for critiquing Islam.
That's right.
And so the video very aptly showed several examples of this oppressor,
heterosexual.
and the remedy.
If you are
heterosexual, you're a member of the oppressor class.
That's right. In fact, that's why we have a Caribbean vulnerable society, because
what makes them vulnerable? Not being heterosexual.
That's right.
They have rejected the binary of male-female relationship, and just by that alone, they are vulnerable. And then by that alone, we are the oppressors. And so how do you undo that? You encourage that way of living
over against the other. And remember that this is not being taught in universities and examined as one would examine different approaches to social organization. This is the ideology.
Presented as a status quo and as a norm.
This is the ideology of the universities to which you cannot come and say anything other than that. Yeah. So if you were to go into some of these Western universities where cultural Marxism is the political ideology and the norm of the institution, if you were to say anything contrary to that, you lose your job.
Well, for example, one of the terms the gentleman used in the video is the term small and powerless minorities.
Small and powerless.
Small and powerless minorities must be protected from the powerful oppressors.
Yeah.
Is the LGBT community a small and powerless minority? Well, according to this critical thinking, they would be so defined.
Yeah.
Well, let us look at some things that have happened recently and see who is the powerless.
Yeah, but
for example,
Israel Follow in
Australia. He put a post on his Facebook page, right? Social media,
Twitter,
social media, and he said, "Hell awaits."
Yeah.
He made a long list of people that, in his opinion,
adulterers,
hell awaited them.
Homosexuals,
liars,
thieves,
fornicators, adulterers.
Standard thing.
He said hell awaits. That is his opinion. That hell awaits such people. Unfortunately for him, including in the group, were practicing homosexuals. Right?
Yes, practicing homosexuals.
He included, and for that reason, he was kicked out of
his contract of $4 million was terminated, shredded.
So who is the powerless minority there?
You see, because organizations like Rugby Australia, those are cultural. They operate into cultural Marxist paradigms.
They operate clearly, and so they're saying that you are a member of an oppressor class because you're heterosexual.
He's Christian.
You're a Christian and you're heterosexual.
And he's a cis. You would call a cisgender.
A man who says he's a man.
Yeah,
that's called a cis man.
A cis man. Yeah, because cis means same.
So if you're a man and you're a man, or you're a special kind of man, you're a cis man. I reject that. I say if you're a man, you're just a man. But anyway.
Well, you can't say that in New York because New York is cultural Marxist. Exactly. You will be fined $250,000.
So this guy, he's heterosexual and he's male.
Yeah.
That's two oppressing things already.
2 strokes against him.
And then he goes and says something like that.
He's a Christian to him. He's heterosexual.
Heterosexual, male Christian. 3 strikes.
3 strikes.
He's out.
So he's out.
Right.
3
And
strikes in the house.
so you ask
Ladies and gentlemen, we just want to repeat this. This is the tyranny. This is, we all know about communism, and people can identify economic communism easily because they say, they remember the Soviet Union. But people don't recognize that there is another type of communism. It's called cultural communism. And it is spreading its wings and oppressing and suppressing freedoms and suppressing Christianity exactly like economic communism did, because it has its same root. It's a root from the same tree.
Okay, so Felix Ngoli.
Yeah.
He was a student in Sheffield.
Yeah.
And he put something on his
Facebook page.
Very offensive in our day to say that marriage
is between a man and a woman.
He implied that.
Well, the cultural Marxists, I call them communism. They are communists.
So Sheffield would have none of that, and they kicked him out for saying that.
Sheffield is a cultural communist organization.
And we could name university after university. In our own university, a Professor
Bain
was infectious diseases
because he
went to court and spoke the truth
about
certain
homosexual practice and the outcomes. Well, and the communities that he was
vulnerable,
that he was speaking quote unquote against, because he was saying their behaviors led to so and so outcome. They were vulnerable. They call themselves vulnerable minorities. So therefore, he, as a cis heterosexual Christian, was
3
fired.
strikes.
Was fired.
He was out.
Cultural Marxism, communism.
So, and for example, if you want to have carte blanche, that means you can do anything you want.
Yeah.
If you're in a university and you want carte blanche, freedom to do and say whatever you want to do and say, and you are black, lesbian, and female, no one can touch you.
Yeah.
You could do whatever you want, say whatever you want, and if they come close to you to even criticize you, you immediately say, I'm aggressed. I'm a victim of aggression.
Whether it is but I think they call it microaggression.
It's a microaggression. Because if you're a black, lesbian woman, that's 3 ins.
But
and you are protected on all 3 of those grounds. And so nobody can safely or with impunity criticize you. Don't mention they cannot fire you. Because immediately somebody tries to fire you for whatever you do, there it is. It's because you're black, it's because you're female, it's because you're lesbian. So on the one hand, this kind of thinking, and I repeat, is to achieve social transformation.
Social transformation.
And we see those societies transformed.
Where
certain groups now have all the power. They can do whatever they want, and you cannot touch them. And certain other groups can do nothing, cannot even speak their minds.
That's right.
Or else they'll be threatened.
So this is communism. It's cultural communism. People are not recognizing it as such, but that is what it is. Now, the point to be made is this, that while this is happening and society is being transformed.
It is being transformed.
Because the only analysis that is allowed in the society is a cultural Marxist analysis of oppressor versus oppressed. Like, for example, you cannot, if you see blacks in America not having the outcomes you'd want them to have, if you start saying, well, maybe it might be...
What about your family structure?
Family structure, fatherlessness.
Oh, no, racist.
It's racist, because the only analysis that will be allowed to determine what's happening in a situation is in the context of group oppression. So blacks don't do as well because of racism.
Yes,
any other analysis is racist.
Yes.
Looking at any other factors that may be involved in blacks not doing as well is racist.
So if a black man has 40 baby mothers, takes drugs, stays on the street corner,
racist.
Drops out of school, and you say, well, your family structure needs to be better, then that's a racist comment.
Racist. No.
If a man goes into a workplace and says Allah Akbar and shoots up the whole place and kills 15 people, and you say, well, it was a Muslim man who went in and did that.
That's Islamophobic.
That's Islamophobic. Although the man was saying Allah Akbar and killing people, and you just say, well, he was a Muslim.
So this is the analysis that is being forced on the society. It is the only analysis that is allowed, because if you go beyond it, like I say, you are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, etc. That is the type of thing. And of course, these groups have to come together. Like, so you will find that the feminists, the LGBT groups, these are the quote-unquote minorities in what they call intersectionalism. So that
to gang up against the power groups.
Right.
White Christian male.
A feminist, LGBT, and so on, must not say anything bad against Islam.
Any other minority.
Because that's a minority.
No matter what.
That's intersectionality.
You have to support each other.
And they all must resist Christianity, heterosexuals, etc.
At all costs. No.
So this is the anti-intellectualism that is dominant in Western universities.
What I want to make though is that not only is that dominant in this is changing the society, because it is, and that's the whole object of it, to change the society. One of the crafty ways in which it is being given power to do this is that parents are paying for the privilege of exposing their children to this.
That's right.
This is a particular crafty thing. Is that you pay $70,000 US per year, and you send your child to a university,
thinking that they're being educated.
You think that they're being educated. How to think, how to analyze, how to look at two sides of an issue.
Oh no, not at all.
No, they are being sent there at a cost to be indoctrinated.
So you are paying for the indoctrination of your children.
Absolutely.
You are paying to make your children anti-intellectual and to be thoroughly indoctrinated into cultural Marxism. And we're going to learn.
No, but listen, before we get to, I think we're going to Jordan Peterson next, which is very critical. But before we go to Jordan Peterson, two critical things they said on the last video is that there are now new pathologies being identified.
Oh, yes.
Well, talk about new pathologies. There are new pathologies now being identified. And it would be shocking to some of our viewers what those pathologies are.
This is what one of the people from the Frankfurt School
identified as pathologies.
Well, in a world, when you come to worldviews, what is right in one will be wrong in the other. This is why God was careful. The Bible is such a great book. You cannot, he said in Isaiah 5 verse 20, 21, he said, woe to those who call what?
Wrong right and right wrong. You must do both at the same time.
You have to do both. You cannot call.
So just to mention the pathologies that they talked about. Which
Christianity was one.
Christianity and patriotism.
The family.
Love of the country, love of your country and your family.
Yeah.
Are pathologies now.
Are pathologies. So, Jordan Peterson is going to tell us how we as parents are paying for our children to be indoctrinated
by dangerous
into
persons.
Cultural Marxism by dangerous people.
Yeah, let's look at that. Yeah.
You may not realize it, but you are currently funding some dangerous people. They are indoctrinating young minds throughout the West with their resentment-ridden ideology. They have made it their life's mission to undermine Western civilization itself, which they regard as corrupt, oppressive, and patriarchal. If you're a taxpayer or paying for your kid's liberal arts degree, you're underwriting this gang of nihilists. You're supporting ideologues who claim that all truth is subjective, that all sex differences are socially constructed, and that Western imperialism is the sole source of all third world problems. They are the postmodernists, pushing progressive activism at a college near you. They produce the mobs that violently shut down campus speakers, the language police who enshrine into law use of fabricated gender pronouns, and the deans whose livelihoods depend on madly rooting out discrimination, where little or none exists. Their thinking took hold in Western universities in the 60s and 70s, when the true believers of the radical left became the professors of today. And now we rack up education-related debt, not so that our children learn to think critically, write clearly, or speak properly, but so they can model their mentor's destructive agenda. It's now possible to complete an English degree and never encounter Shakespeare, one of those dead white males whose works underlie our society of oppression. To understand and oppose the postmodernists, the ideas by which they orient themselves must be clearly identified. First is their new unholy trinity of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Diversity is defined not by opinion, but by race, ethnicity, or sexual identity. Equity is no longer the laudable goal of equality of opportunity, but the insistence on equality of outcome. And inclusion is the use of identity-based quotas to attain this misconceived state of equity. All the classic rights of the West are to be considered secondary to these new values. Take, for example, freedom of speech, the very pillar of democracy. The postmodernists refuse to believe that people of goodwill can exchange ideas and reach consensus. Their world is instead a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power. They don't see ideas that run contrary to their ideology as simply incorrect. They see them as integral to the oppressive system they wish to supplant, and consider it a moral obligation to stifle and constrain their expression. Second is rejection of the free market, of the very idea that free voluntary trading benefits everyone. They won't acknowledge that capitalism has lifted up hundreds of millions of people, so they can, for the first time in history, afford food, shelter, clothing, transportation, even entertainment and travel. Those classified as poor in the US, and increasingly everywhere else, are able to meet their basic needs. Meanwhile, in once prosperous Venezuela, until recently the poster child of the campus radicals, the middle class lines up for toilet paper. Third and finally are the politics of identity. Postmodernists don't believe in individuals. You're an exemplar of your race, sex, or sexual preference. You're also either a victim or an oppressor. No wrong can be done by anyone in the former group, and no good by the latter. Such ideas of victimization do nothing but justify the use of power and engender intergroup conflict. All these concepts originated with Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher. Marx viewed the world as a gigantic class struggle, the bourgeoisie against the proletariat, the grasping rich against the desperate poor. But wherever his ideas were put into practice, in the Soviet Union, China, Vietnam, and Cambodia, to name just a few, whole economies failed and tens of millions were killed. We fought a decades-long Cold War to stop the spread of those murderous notions. But they're back, in the new guise of identity politics. The corrupt ideas of the postmodern neo-Marxists should be consigned to the dustbin of history. Instead, we underwrite their continuance in the very institutions where the central ideas of the West should be transmitted across the generations. Unless we stop, postmodernism will do to America and the entire Western world what it's already done to its universities. I'm Jordan Peterson, professor of psychology at the University of Toronto, for Prager University. Thank you for watching this video. To help keep PragerU videos free, please consider making a tax-deductible donation.
So Jordan Peterson is telling us...
He's a philosopher.
He's a philosopher. He's a professor of psychology who was almost kicked out of the University of Toronto because he said he's not going to be forced to use certain pronouns because somebody wanted him to do it.
Yeah.
And of course, Canada is a completely cultural
Was
Marxist.
he fired though?
No, I think
he wasn't fired, but he was...
He's marginalized.
Yeah, marginalized. And there were protests against him.
Yes, lots of protests. The point to be made is that he is pointing out that dangerous people are teaching our children.
At a price.
At a price that we are paying for. Because you think you are sending children to universities to learn to be critical thinkers and to analyze the pros and cons of various political theories. But what is happening in Western democracies, Western universities, is that the children who go there, the students who go there, the young people who go there, are being indoctrinated into cultural Marxism. The universities are the seminaries of the religion of cultural Marxism. Nobody else is teaching it.
That's well put.
Nobody else
It's a dogma. It's dogma.
It's religion. Yeah. Nobody else is teaching it anywhere. It's in the universities that it is taught. And then the people who come out of the universities implement it in the society.
The lawyers and the social workers and the lecturers
in the society
have been indoctrinated.
So here we have a situation in which universities should be the place where political theories are analyzed and critiqued.
And diversity of thought.
And there's a diversity in order to have the best option for the society. But instead of that, you will find that the universities are the place where cultural Marxist political ideology comes up. Feminism, LGBTism, all this considered of racism, the analysis of the society that is done in an anti-intellectual way of just saying oppressor, oppressed. And that is how the society.
And if the oppressor is coming to your college, burn it down.
So if you were to go in some university on the campus and say, let us look at family structure and its role in the way blacks have been not improved economically, you will be called racist. In fact, you wouldn't be allowed on the campus.
And also, one of the points I think Jordan Peterson made very well is that people are not interested in equality of opportunity, really. No. They're interested in equality of outcome.
That's right.
So you are obligated to make sure that the person who does little and the person who does much. The person who comes from a stable family where mother and father are helping them, and the one who comes from a dysfunctional family where the mother is there with so many children and the father has gone his own way, that those persons get the same outcome.
The same outcome, because
he's saying that is
social justice, that's what I call social justice warriors.
That you must ensure the equality of outcome.
Even God doesn't ensure equality of outcome, because the scripture Proverbs say, if you sleep and you don't work, you follow the ant. But social justice warriors, which comes out of this identity politics, which comes out of cultural Marxism, all of these things which come out of the universities, is what part of our science.
And we mustn't ignore either the role that falsehood plays in pushing this thing.
Absolutely.
It's founded largely on a tissue of lies, like so many other evils that are in the society. It's founded on lies.
And the fact that the other thing too,
and denial of
what
truth.
they call the elite media, all the people who come through places like, the CNNs of the world and so on, they all come through this cultural Marxist thing in liberal universities, and they are presenting that narrative in the media as well. So there's a lot more that we will be talking about. But we want to leave you today that the mind, what the universities, certainly in the humanities and many of these sociology departments are doing, they're not opening minds, they're closing minds. And they are making the minds monolith, really, as Wilmot Perkins said, intellectual ghettos that are committed to defending cultural Marxism in its various forms. And we are feeling the effects of that in the society today. What we really want are universities that are open-minded, that are willing to take on debate as to dialogue and debate as universities
speech,
ought to.
Yes, freedom of speech, contending ideas in the public square. It's supposed to happen there. And if it doesn't happen there, then persons who are indoctrinated there, one wouldn't really say educated, those who are indoctrinated there at a cost.
I call them trained brains. Their brains are trained.
They then come out in the society and impose those ideas on the society. It's a very sad state of affairs.
And of course, what they are imposing is things that are absolutely contrary to God.
Absolutely contrary to truth.
Absolutely
contrary to God. It's all based on lies. Well, this has been the Issachar Hour. Again, we hope you have learned something, and we are going to end today with a verse from Isaiah 5. I'm going to read several verses from Isaiah 5, which are quite relevant and germane to what we've been talking about today, talking about the closing of the university mind. Woe unto them that call evil good, and good evil, that put darkness for light, and light for darkness, that put bitter for sweet, and sweet for bitter. Woe unto them that are wise in their own eyes, and prudent in their own sight. Woe unto them that are mighty to drink wine, and men of strength to mingle strong drink. And then lastly, and very importantly, which justify the wicked for reward. Justify the wicked for reward, and take away the righteousness of the righteous from him.
This has been the Issachar Hour.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Look forward to
being pleasure.
We continue the closing of the university mind next time.
Thank you so much.